Kia ora, kia rana, Nisabula Vinaka, Talofa Lava. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Tamatoa Bambridge. I have admired Tamatoa's work for decades now, and I've had the great opportunity to be able to work with him a little bit in working groups over the past, I don't know how many years, but in areas looking at biocultural approaches to conservation, looking at this braiding of customary knowledge systems and formal Western science. And that is what you will hear from Tamatoa today. We heard this morning from Christina talking about legal pluralism. This is an area where Tamatoa is an expert. Tamatoa is an anthropologist who specializes in legal anthropology. He's the research director at the National Center for Scientific Research, ICRS, working in the Laboratory of Marine Biology in Moorea since 2007. He has more than 20 years of field research experience in many of the archipelagos of French Polynesia. Much of his work, as I expect we'll hear about this afternoon, deals with land and marine tenure rooted in his early field work on land and kinship in the Austral Islands. Tamatoa is an expert in local empowerment of capacity development, as more and more situations that he's encountered have had to deal with these legal pluralism issues. He has a long-term commitment to the understanding of the Polynesian traditional management of resources, leading to the publication of the Rahui in 2016 through ANU Press, and the creation of the Rahui Center, which is sponsored by Bloomberg Philanthropy. Tamatoa teaches at the École Pratique des Hautes Études at the University of French Polynesia and the University of New Caledonia at the research master's level. Won't you please join me in welcoming Dr. Tamatoa Bambridge.
Yes, hello everyone, Yorana. Good morning, good afternoon. It is a great honor to be here today, and I would like to sincerely thank the organizers of the International Coral Reef Symposium for inviting me to deliver this lecture. Especially, I would like to thank Stacy Jupiter and also Georgia Wilson for taking good care of me. I am a terrible guest, I must admit. As Stacy said, I'm not a coral reef ecologist. I am an anthropologist. For the last 15 years, however, I have had the privilege of working with, within the marine laboratory ecology at the CURIOB, alongside coral reef ecologists, fisheries scientists, geneticists, and conservation practitioners. Living in this interdisciplinary environment had changed the way I think about coral reef. Like many anthropologists, I initially believed that my work was about institutions, culture, and governance, while my colleagues were working on reef, fishes, and ecosystems. Over time, I realized that this distinction was misleading, and we were studying the same system from different directions. That realization led me to a simple hypothesis, which I would like to explore with you today. Coral reef resilience is not only an ecological property, it is also an institutional one. The capacity of reef to recover from disturbance depends not only on ecological processes, such as connectivity, herbivory, or functional diversity. It also depends on the institutions through which societies organize cooperation, legitimate authority, and transmit knowledge across generations. Institutions shape behavior. Behavior shapes ecological dynamics. And together, they influence the trajectories of coral reef ecosystems. Today, I would like to examine this proposition through the example of one Polynesian institution, the Rahui. So, Over the past 50 years, coral reef science has transformed our understanding of why reefs flourish, decline, and sometimes recover. We now recognize the importance of herbivory, larval connectivity, trophic interactions, functional diversity, and increasingly, the profound consequences of marine heat waves. These advances have fundamentally changed conservation practice. Yet, one question remains. Why do reefs exposed to similar ecological pressures often follow very different trajectories? Why do some communities sustain reef ecosystems over generations while others struggle to do so, even when ecological knowledge is available? Part of the answer, I would suggest, lies in the institution through which people organize their relationships with the living world. So, why Rahui? Rahui offers a particularly interesting way to explore this question. Many conservation scientists describe Rahui as a temporary fish enclosure. That description is not wrong, but it captures only one aspect of a much broader institution. Rahui is better understood as a system of governance that organizes relationship between people and places, between present and future generations, and between human societies and the ecosystem on which they depend. Its purpose is not simply to restrict extraction. Its purpose is to create the condition under which abundance can continually regenerate. Seen from this perspective, Rahui is more than a traditional management practice. It offers a way of thinking about resilience in which ecological recovery depends not only on biological processes, but also on the capacity of societies to govern themselves. During the last 2 decades, resilience theory has increasingly recognized that ecosystems and societies cannot be understood separately. Concepts such as socio-ecological system, adaptive governance, adaptive co-management have shown that institutions influence ecological outcomes, just as ecological changes reshape institutions. This has been one of the major intellectual achievements of contemporary conservation science. What I find particularly fascinating is Rahui has long embodied many of these principles for centuries. This is not because Polynesian society somehow anticipated resilience theory, nor because indigenous institutions should be romanticized. Rather, Rahui offers something that resilience scientists rarely have the opportunity to study, a living institution that has persisted for more than a millennium while continually adapting to changing ecological, political, and social conditions. That longevity makes Rahui more than an object of anthropological interest. It provides an opportunity to examine how institutional resilience contributes to ecological resilience. To understand why Rahui has endured for more than a millennium, we need to understand the philosophical principles upon which it rests. 4 concepts are particularly important: tapu, mana, hau, and mauri. These words are often translated into English, but translation alone tells us very little. Instead of asking what these concepts mean, I would like to ask what they do. Because together, they organize relationships between authority, responsibility, and the living world. Let us begin with tapu. In many Western accounts, tapu is translated simply as prohibition. That translation captures only the surface. The purpose of tapu is not prohibition itself. Its purpose is regeneration. By temporarily regulating access to a place, an activity, or species, communities create the condition under which ecological and social relationships can recover. Restriction, therefore, is not the objective. Renewal is. From the perspective of resilience theory, tapu does not seek to eliminate disturbance. It creates the conditions that allow systems to recover from disturbance. Let me talk about the second concept, mana. Mana is often translated as power or authority, but this translation remains incomplete. Mana describes authority made legitimate through responsibility. Chief or Tohunga experts, families and communities do not possess mana just because they exercise power. They possess mana insofar as they fulfill obligation towards the territories, the species, relationship, and the relationship entrusted to their care. In other words, legitimacy is not external to stewardship. It is one of its foundations. Finally, there is Ho and Maori. Ho refers to the vital force that circulates through relationships and exchanges. Maori designate the vitality that animates living beings, places, and ecosystems. Together, they remind us that abundance is never simply a property of nature. It emerges from relationships. Fish population, reef, lagoons, and human communities do not exist independently from one another. Their vitality depends on the quality of the relationship that connect them. Taken together, this concept suggests a broader understanding of resilience. Resilience is not the capacity of an ecosystem to absorb disturbance. It is also the capacity of relationships to endure, adapt, and regenerate. I believe this relational understanding represents one of the most important contributions that Rahui can make to contemporary coral reef science. If Rahui survived only in archaeological record or anthropological archives, it will already deserve our attention. Few systems of environmental governance have persisted for more than 1,000 years. What makes Rahui scientifically remarkable, however, is that it has never remained static. Across French Polynesia, communities continue to reinterpret and redesign Rahui in response to changing ecological conditions, economic realities, and political circumstances. Climate change, tourism, demographic change, new fisheries, global markets have all transformed the context in which coastal communities live. Rahui has endured not because it resisted to change, but because each generation adapted it to new circumstances while preserving its underlying principles. This distinction is fundamental. Resilient institutions are not those that remain unchanged. They are those that retain their legitimacy while continually learning and adapting. And this capacity for adaptation is precisely what resilience theory seeks to understand. This adaptive capacity is closely related to another important Polynesian concept, puna. Literally, puna means spring or source. It may refer to a freshwater spring, an ancestral place, the dwelling of deity, or the origin of a particular species. In every case, the idea is the same. Abundance depends upon protecting the place and the processes from which life continually emerges. At first sight, this may appear distant from contemporary ecology. Yet, marine scientists express a remarkably similar concern. We identify nursery habitats, spawning aggregations, larval connectivity, and trophic interactions as the ecological processes that sustain productivity. The language differs, and so does the underlying ontology. But the question is essentially the same. How do we protect the conditions that allow abundance to renew itself? Of course, this perspective shifts conservation away from protecting stock alone towards safeguarding the processes that generate them. Long before resilience become part of ecological vocabulary, Polynesian societies has developed institutions designed to protect precisely those processes. Thinking in terms of relationship also change the scale at which governance operates. If abundance emerges from interconnected processes, governance cannot stop at the shoreline. Watersheds, forests, freshwater systems, agriculture, fisheries, and ceremonial life all influence the health of coral reef. Today, we describe this perspective as a reach-to-reef approach, or more broadly, as a socio-ecological system. For Polynesian communities, however, these connections were never separate domains waiting to be integrated. They were understood at different dimensions for the same living whenua, land and seascapes. Perhaps this is one of the most important lessons indigenous governance offers contemporary conservation. Rather than beginning by separating ecological and social processes, it begins by assuming that they are inseparable. This perspective has guided our work for over the past 15 years at the Rahui Center. People often ask me or us, how many Rahui have been established, expecting the expansion of a conservation program? But what you are seeing is actually the geographic growth of institutional diversity. Today, more than 40 Rahui exist across the 5 archipelagos of French Polynesia. They differ in scale, objectives, governance arrangements, and ecological context. Some focus on fisheries, others on food security, cultural revitalization, or territorial governance. Each reflects the priorities and histories of the community at the origin of it. From the perspective of conventional conservation, such diversity may appear problematic. Scientists often seek interventions that can be standardized and replicated. Rahui follow a different logic. Its strength lies precisely in its capacity to generate locally adapted institutions rather than identical management systems. What travels from one island to another is therefore not a particular regulation, but a governance process, a way of deliberating collectively, negotiating rules, adapting to change, and maintaining legitimacy over time. That distinction, I believe, is key. The island of Rapa illustrates this particularly well. Rapa Iti, not Rapa Nui, it is in the south of French Polynesia. Rapa is often presented as one of the oldest and most enduring examples of Rahui in contemporary Polynesia. Yet its significance lies less in its longevity than in its remarkable capacity for reinvention. Over the past 4 decades, the objective of the Rahui have changed repeatedly. It has served at the very beginning to strengthen food security, but it was obtained after 4 years. Then it was used to reinforce territorial sovereignty and then maintaining cultural continuity by reconnecting younger generation with their ancestral islands. More recently, carefully regulated lobster harvest have generated revenues that support education, housing, and social programs for Rapa residents in Tahiti. The institution has remained the same because its legitimacy has never depended on fixed objectives. It has depended on the community capacity to redefine those objectives in responses to changing circumstances. Ecologists readily accept that ecosystems evolve. Rapa reminds us that resilient institutions must evolve as well. Up to this point, I have argued that Rahui should be understood not as a traditional management practice, but as an adaptive institution, one that learns, evolves, and maintains legitimacy while responding to ecological and social change. These propositions are conceptually appealing, but they remain hypotheses. The question from the perspective of coral reef science is whether these institution dynamics can actually be observed in ecological systems. Do adaptive institutions produce different ecological trajectories? That question has guided our interdisciplinary research at the Curie Hub over the past 15 years, and it is now to that evidence that I now turn. Our first observation emerged before we measure a single fish. Where Rahui succeeded, community had first succeeded in governing themselves. Meetings were held, disagreements were debated, rules were negotiated, knowledge was shared, authority was discussed rather than assumed. Participation often required months, sometimes years. From a conventional conservation perspective, these processes can appear slow. But communities often move at a different rhythm. They understand that ecological restoration depends on social agreement. Without agreement, regulation remains fragile. Without legitimacy, compliance rapidly declines. This may be the first lesson that anthropology contributes to conservation science. Before restoring ecosystems, society frequently restores institutions. One of the most compelling demonstrations comes from Teahupo'o. Many of you know Teahupo'o for another reason. It is one of the world's famous surfing waves. But beneath those extraordinary waves lies a coral reef whose recent history illustrates the ecological consequences of collective governance. Following the establishment of the Rahui in Tehupo, ecological monitoring documented substantial changes in reef fish communities. Fish density and biomass increased. Commercially important species became more common. None of these results surprised marine ecologists. Reduced fishing pressure is expected to produce exactly these responses. The more interesting question is why fishing pressure changed in the first place. The answer was not surveillance alone, nor was it stricter enforcement. Fishing practices changed because the community collectively negotiated, accepted, and maintained new rules governing access to the reef. Compliance emerged primarily through legitimacy. People respected the Rahui because they recognized it as their own institution rather than an external imposed regulation. From this perspective, as I said, the ecological response cannot be separated from the institutional process that made behavioral change possible. In other words, legitimacy is not simply a political condition of conservation. It is one of the mechanisms through which conservation produces ecological outcomes. Our second example comes from Tautira, the district municipality next to Tehupo. Conservation is often framed as a choice between exploitation and protection. Ecosystems are either open to fishing or closed to it. The Rahui propose another possibility. What if the purpose of Rahui were not to prohibit fishing, but to make fishing possible? In Tautira, a period of protection alternates with carefully organized collective harvest. You can see that the Rahui designed by the Tautira community, a zone in the middle, they call it the Puna, that is closed forever, whereas Zone 1 and Zone B are alternatively open and closed. In Tautira, as I said, these openings are not arbitrary. They are negotiated collectively, informed by ecological observations, and regulated through quotas, authorized fishing gears, and size limits. From an ecological, oh, I went too fast, no. From an ecological perspective, disturbance is not eliminated, it is organized. That distinction is important. Instead of opposing people and ecosystems, governance seek to synchronize ecological renewal and social needs. Instead of opposing conservation and resource use, the objective is neither permanent closure nor maximum extraction. It is continual adjustment. Benefits are distributed across the community. The reopening is therefore not simply a harvest. It is also a ceremony of collective responsibility. Adaptive governance, therefore, is not defined by fixed rule. It is defined by the capacity to modify rules while maintaining both ecological sustainability and social legitimacy. Our final example illustrates a different lesson. Not every Rahui succeeds equally. Arutua reminds us that institutions are never away from conflict and sometimes injustice. Unlike the high islands we have considered so far, Arutua, which is an atoll, is one of the principal supplier of lagoon fish. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, this is the atoll of Arutua. In the village, you have only one pass in Arutua. In the village is exactly where around the pass. And unlike the high island we have considered so far, Arutua is one of the principal suppliers of lagoon fish for the wider territory of French Polynesia. Fishing efforts is intensive, economic interests are substantial, and access to productive fishing grounds has important consequences for livelihoods. As discussion progressed, fundamental questions emerge. Who should participate in decision-making? Whose interests should take priority? How should the costs and benefits of conservation be shared? From the perspective of conservation biology, closing a productive fishing grounds often appears self-evident. But from the perspective of many fishers, however, the same places represent family histories, inherited rights, and economic security. The challenge was therefore not ecological, it was institutional. Some members of the community perceived the proposed Rahui as reinforcing existing inequalities rather than reducing them. This example highlights an important point. Institutions do not create social tension from nothing. More often, they reveal tensions that already exist. Whether those tensions can be negotiated while maintaining legitimacy largely determines whether ecological gains can be sustained over time. For this reason, communities frequently evaluate conservation through perception of fairness, as much as through ecological indicators. As I was saying, institutional resilience and ecological resilience cannot easily be separated. These examples I have presented are all drawn from French Polynesia. They emerge from a particular history, culture, and specific relationship with the sea. For that reason, I do not believe Rahui should be understood as a model to be exported. What can travel is something different. It is not the institution itself. It is the scientific insight that institutions are not merely the social context within which ecological processes unfold. They are among the variables that shape those processes. For many years, coral reef science has sought to explain ecological trajectories through environmental drivers, temperature, fishing pressure, habitat complexity, connectivity, or species interactions. These variables remain fundamental. But the Polynesian experience suggests that we should add another dimension. How societies organize cooperation, negotiate authority, and resolve conflict also influence ecological trajectories. Institutions deserve to be treated not simply as governance outcomes, but as explanatory variables within socio-ecological systems. That, I believe, is one of the principal contributions anthropology can make to coral reef science. This reflection This perspective also changed the way we think about legitimacy. In conservation, legitimacy is often regarded as a social objective. Communities ask whether decision is fair, whether participation is genuine, and whether authority is recognized. Ecologists tend to ask another question: does conservation work? The example we have examined suggests that this question cannot be separated. Rules that are biologically sound but socially illegitimate rarely endure. Conversely, institutions that enjoy broad legitimacy often succeed because communities choose to maintain them over time. Legitimacy, therefore, does more than facilitate conservation. It contributes directly to the behavioral change through which ecological recovery becomes possible. Perhaps we should begin to think of legitimacy not simply as a political concept, but as an ecological process operating through human behavior. This reflection also invites us to reconsider the place of knowledge in conservation. Over the last 2 decades, there has been growing recognition of indigenous and local knowledge within environmental science. This evolution has been extremely important. But I would like to suggest that knowledge itself is not enough. Knowledge becomes influential when institutions allow it to circulate, to be discussed, and to inform collective decisions. Throughout the Rahui that we have seen, ecological monitoring became most effective when scientists and communities learned together. Fishers contributed, observation accumulated over generations. In some cases, like here, we have this tempo program. The fishers also contributed to design new methodology to survey. Ecologists contributed quantitative monitoring. Neither replaced the other. Together, they produced a shared understanding of ecological change. Monitoring, therefore, became more than the production of data. It became part of governance itself. Perhaps one of the most promising directions for future coral reef science is not simply to integrate different kinds of knowledge, but to build institutions capable of learning collectively. Climate change makes this perspective even more urgent. No community can prevent marine heat waves. No local institution can stop ocean acidification. The future of coral reef ultimately depends upon global political decision. Nothing that I have said today should be interpreted otherwise. As ecological uncertainty increases, what enables societies to continue adapting? Perhaps the reef most likely to persist will not necessarily be those exposed to the least disturbance. There may be those whose communities remain capable of learning, reorganizing, and acting collectively despite disturbance. Adaptation has always been central to resilience. Climate change simply raised the stakes. In an increasingly uncertain world, institutional resilience becomes as important as ecological resilience. For much of its history, conservation has been organized around the management of natural resources. Resources are measured, protected, restored, allocated. These remain essential tasks. Rahui does not reject them. It asks us to begin somewhere else. It begins with relationships. Relationships between reef and watersheds, between fish and fishers, between elders and youth, between authority and responsibility, between present generations and those yet to come. If coral reefs are indeed socio-ecological systems, then these relationships are not external to conservation. They are part of the very system that conservation seeks to maintain. This, ultimately, is the broader lesson I draw from the Polynesian experience. Not a management model to be copied, not an indigenous institution to be idealized, but a reminder that ecological resilience and institutional resilience evolve together. Healthy reefs support resilient communities. Resilient communities are better able to sustain healthy reefs. Neither can be understood in isolation. Let me conclude by returning to the question with which I began. Why do some coral reefs remain resilient across generations? Perhaps one of the next frontiers of coral reef science lies not only beneath the surface of the ocean, but also within the institutions through which societies choose to live with the sea. Throughout this lecture, I have argued that Rahui should not be understood as a blueprint for conservation. Its values lies elsewhere. It reminds us that conservation is not only about protecting ecosystem. It is also about cultivating the relationships that allow people to care for them together. In English, we often speak of managing natural resources. Management evokes planning, organization, and efficiency. These are indispensable. Yet, the word also suggests that we stand outside the system we manage. Rahui proposes a different image. Human beings do not stand outside coral reef. We belong to them. We participate in a web of relationships linking reef and watershed, fish and fishers, ancestors and descendants, science and society. Stewardship, therefore, becomes more than an intervention. It becomes a way of inhabiting the living world. If that is true, then the future of coral reef conservation depends upon more than restoring corals, rebuilding fish populations, or expanding marine protected areas. All of these remain important, but they will never be sufficient unless we also cultivate the institutions that enable people to care for reefs together. Because coral reefs are not only biological ecosystems, they are communities of life sustained by communities of people. And perhaps the greatest challenge before us is not simply to understand coral reef more deeply, but to learn how to govern our relationship with them more wisely. I thank you very much for your listening. Maruru.
I know everyone's leaving, but we just have a small token of appreciation for Tamatoa. Thank you so much. One housekeeping announcement. I know everyone's rushing to get to sessions. This theater will be closed for the setup for the banquet this evening. If you are coming and you have a ticket, please wear your name badge. There's a little dinner plate on the back, and that is your entry into the banquet this evening. For those coming, we'll see you at 7 p.m. Thank you.